today it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Cynthia Enloe, class of 1960. Cynthia has worked for more than 30 years as a researcher, author, and activist to call attention to women's struggles around the world. She earned her doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley, and has taught political science and women's studies at Clark University since 1972. She is currently research professor in the Department of International Development, Community and Environment, and Women's Studies at Clark University. Cynthia's current research interests are the interactions of feminism, women, militarized culture, war, politics, and global economics in such countries as Japan, Iraq, the United States, Britain, the Philippines, Canada, Chile, and Turkey. Where are the women is her central question, and the question of a generation of feminist scholars who are learning from her. One reviewer wrote of Cynthia, and I quote, "Hardly any feminist author has shown as impressively as Cynthia Enloe that international politics is not understood by a restricted perspective on what important statesmen do. Instead, we should look at the everyday lives of girls and women, at the silent women behind the state's men, at those working in textile factories, at sex workers, and at women refugees. Cynthia Enloe aims at giving voice to those never heard in international politics. She not only claims that the personal is political, but that the personal is international too." Cynthia has had Fulbright fellowships in Malaysia and Guyana. She was named Outstanding Teacher 3 times at Clark and received the Connecticut College Medal in 2000 in recognition of her work. The latest of her 12 books, Nemo's War, Emma's War, Making Feminist Sense of the Iraq War, was published earlier this month. Please join me in welcoming Cynthia Enloe.
My hero. My hero.
Connecticut is so lucky to have such great professors as Julie.
She's my hero.
I'm so delighted to be here. But I have to tell you, I'm a little nervous about talking in front of the class of 60 because they know everything about me. It's really, I can kind of dress up, but they know really what's underneath. So I'll try to get over my nerves. In the short time that we have today, I want to first thank all the people who've organized. Can we give a hand to all the folks that organized these? We all know this takes months and weeks of emailing and double-checking and triple-checking and then going back and redoing. So it's wonderful that we're all here under the same roof at the same time. I thought what I might talk about today, and maybe we'd have a little time for a discussion, is about what Iraqi women's lives have been like. I was trying to think what might be interesting to everybody. Is this too echoey? No, it's not, okay. And I was thinking, well, maybe I should talk about one of the American women that have been affected by the war, and I was going to talk about a woman named Charlene Kane from Wisconsin, who's the mother of a very severely wounded American soldier's son. But then I thought, this is Connecticut. This is where we stretch. Right? And I thought actually what you all would rather try and engage with is something that perhaps all of us know much less about, and that is Iraqi women's lives, which, despite having been at war with Iraq and actually been engaged with Iraqi affairs for 40 or 50 years, most of us here in the United States know woefully little about quote-unquote ordinary, there is no such thing as ordinary, Iraqi women. So the woman I'd like to just talk about a little bit is a woman named Maha Hashim. She's a real woman. I haven't met her. Maha was born before the first of the last 3 Iraq wars. You know, when you try to think about a country, and a lot of you I know travel, and so you think about a lot of countries aside from the United States, but oftentimes we think of just the war that we've been following without thinking about how people in those countries have experienced war. Maha, who would probably be here with the class, well, she'd be a little younger. She'd probably be with the class of maybe 45, of what, 50, 60, 75. She was born before the Iran-Iraq War. Now, that's an 8-year-long war. It was a devastating war for Iran and Iraq. The United States government supported which government in the war between Iran and Iraq? Iraq. The United States supported the Saddam Hussein regime in the 8-year-long war. She survived that war. She was married to a mid-level policeman living in a comfortable middle-class neighborhood in Baghdad. As in any big city, and a lot of you who have grown up or now live in big cities know that what happens in the world really is affected by which neighborhood you live in, not just which city you live in. And she lived in a neighborhood called Sadia, which in Iraqi terms was, quote, mixed. You know, in any country, when you hear the word mixed, as in mixed marriage or mixed neighborhood, in fact, you have to know what people in that country think of as mixed. In 1990s, early 2000s, Iraq mixed mean that there were Shiite and Sunni and Kurdish and Lebanese and a few Christian people in the neighborhood. And that's partly because it was a neighborhood that was quite comfortable, not at the top of the line, but quite comfortable. And what mattered most for getting a house in this neighborhood is that you had to be seen as loyal to the Ba'athist regime. The Ba'athist party is the party that rules Iraq or ruled Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And she managed to get through the Iran-Iraq war. She had children. She had a good marriage. It was a nice neighborhood to live in. Then she survived the 10 years from 1991 to 2003, more than 10 years, international sanctions, which the United States backed very strongly, which devastated the Iraqi economy. She lived through those, held her family together. And then in 2003, at first, the war didn't really affect Maha. But as you know, the war began to have different phases, the Iraq War. After the U.S. invasion, the sectarian sentiments that had been kept undercover during decades in Iraq, between particularly the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis, really bubbled up into the surface. And one of the things that happened with the Ba'athist regime being swept away, with the police department being dismantled, with the army being dismantled, is that, in fact, there were a lot of armaments available. Some of them were American imported guns that weren't carefully cataloged. Others were guns that had been available in Iraq itself. And as a result of both the bubbling up of these resentments and the availability of guns, you had the beginnings of, and then the burgeoning of, armed militias. Now, as a feminist, what you always do is you always ask, what was the makeup of those militias? And from what we know, they were almost entirely male. That is, in some societies, as you know, insurgent armies, in fact, have very high percentages of women. If you looked at the insurgent army in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, it grew to be 30% women. But the militias in Iraq, no matter which side they were on, and they were battling each other, they were overwhelmingly male. Maha had the war come home to her comfortable neighborhood then after over a year of the war. because her husband was assassinated by one of the militias. So that meant she became a widow and a head of household. In short time after that, a sectarian militia truck driver loaded his truck with explosives and drove straight into her middle-class house. She managed to escape with her children. At that point, and this is when many Iraqis now were feeling under threat, not only from the U.S. military, but also from the sectarian militias and the general sense of lawlessness that followed the American invasion. Maha did what a lot of Iraqi women and men did, and she tried to flee the country. Now, the people in Iraq who could flee the country, we know, were not the poorest Iraqis, because you had to have bus fare, or you had to have access to a car. The fact that Maha had some savings meant that she could take her children and make the long, dangerous drive across Iraq north to Syria. Now, Syria is in the news in the United States mainly as what? How does Syria, as a terrorist, as a home of terrorists? Well, one of the things that Syria became during the Iraq War was a home to Iraqi refugees. Syria and Jordan between them took in over 2 million Iraqi refugees. The Syrian government was very nervous about taking in 1 million refugees. It's a big country territorially, but it's not a very wealthy country. It has an authoritarian regime, but it's also a nervous regime, which means it's nervous about unemployment. Sound unfamiliar? And so the Syrians did two things, the Syrian government. They allowed Maha and other Iraqis to come into Syria and said, you are our guests. But you cannot have working papers. Now, a lot of the Iraqi refugees were women. When you hear refugees, you always ask the gender question, always. And the Iraqi refugees were a majority women with their dependent children. Maha then was a classic Iraq War refugee in Syria. Now, they're more feminists than ever working in international refugee agencies, international aid agencies, and this is the reason we know what I'm about to tell you. And that is that one of the things that began to happen to women who became refugees and were not able to work, but they were responsible for their own children, and now they're outside the country, you can fill in the blanks, I bet. And that is that a lot of them went into prostitution. It didn't matter whether you were educated. It didn't matter whether you used to be comfortably middle class. It didn't matter whether you were a mother. It didn't matter whether, in fact, this went totally against your values. You had one goal, and that is to find at least enough money to support your children. That was the sine qua non of making your daily life as a refugee in Damascus, or if you're in Jordan, in Amman. We don't know what Maha did. Like many women who've been forced to be refugees, and that can happen to anybody, you know. Nobody is born a refugee. You become a refugee. And when you become a refugee, you can't predict ahead of time what choices you're going to make. What we do know is that a lot of women who went into or were pushed into or were tricked into prostitution in Damascus and Amman as refugees from Iraq, we do know that most of them tried to cover it up. Because if you had any hope at all of going home, you couldn't go home if anybody knew that about you, no matter what the deep moral reasons you had for going into prostitution. So we don't know, and I don't want to insinuate, we do not know how Maha survived. What we do know is that after a year, she ran out of money. And in December of 2007, she heard the siren call, if you will, from Baghdad, from the Maliki government, to refugees overseas, come home. Because what had happened is that really almost the whole middle class, and particularly the whole professional class, surgeons, doctors, psychologists, university teachers, were the ones who had the wherewithal to leave the country. And the Maliki government invited people to come back. Not many people did. Not many people today are. It's still too dangerous. But Maha had run out of money, and so she got on a bus with her children, and she came back to Baghdad. But her neighborhood was still occupied by the militiamen who had driven her out. And in fact, what we do know from another source, you have to just piece together things like this. You know, it's not all in one place. You keep hunting. What we do know from another source, and this is actually from an American military commander who was in charge of trying to oust the militia from this neighborhood, we do know that the militia, when they came into the neighborhood, amongst their other enterprises, these militias are very entrepreneurial. They have to raise money. They raise money by taxing shopkeepers, by having extortion money from people that they rent houses to, and in Sadia, they opened a brothel. Now, as a feminist, what you want to know is, who's in the brothel? Is it other widows? Are they all Iraqi? From which ethnic and sectarian groups? What do the men who go to the brothel in Sadia, run by the militiamen, do they care what the sect is of the woman that they are buying? We know nothing. We know nothing about the politics and the thoughts and the ideas and the strategies of the women in that brothel. We do know that Maha wasn't able to go home. She had to double, triple, quadruple up with her uncle who lived in a high-rise in Baghdad. And when she was interviewed, because now you have 12 people in a two-bedroom apartment in central Baghdad. Now, in international legal terms, Maha no longer is a refugee. You have to cross an international border to be labeled or be treated as, to get the benefits, if you will, of being a refugee. If you are forced out of your home and have to move to another neighborhood or another city altogether in your own country, in international legal terms, you are now an internally displaced person, and you will sometimes be labeled simply an IDP. Well, Maha was not simply a set of initials. She was a very complicated person. She had gone through trauma. She was still responsible for her children. She was now living in very tight quarters with her uncle and his children. She was eligible for a widow's benefit. One of the things that Americans perhaps didn't realize, because we were so focused on how authoritarian and oftentimes violent the Saddam Hussein regime was, that in fact it had one of the best welfare systems in all of the Middle East. So there were widows' pensions, but that means you have to be able to go across town to the Ministry of Social Welfare to get them. That means going through checkpoints. Checkpoints are very, very, very dangerous. People who quote-unquote, man checkpoints are oftentimes very nervous, and they have guns. It is very, very risky to go through checkpoints. Secondly, if you get there, you have to show documentation that you are who you are and that you've lost the husband you claim you've lost. But if your house has just been firebombed and you have managed to get your kids out and you have rushed across the country into another country, Syria, you are not likely to have all the documentation that you need. So Maha, while eligible, did not have the wherewithal to prove that she was eligible for social welfare benefits. When she was asked, what she said she most needed was a job. Now, women's employment in Iraq was amongst the highest in the Middle East. Not because Saddam Hussein and the Baathists were feminists, Lord knows, but as with so many governments around the world, including sometimes our own, in fact, women's paid work was seen as the avenue for the country's modernization. That is, if you want to modernize your country, you cannot afford to waste the talents and the energies and the skills of half your adult population. So in the 1970s and 80s, the Saddam Hussein regime encouraged women to go to school, encouraged women to go into the paid labor force. That's why so many women were in the professions. Maha needed now to get paid work so she could support her kids and get out of her uncle's apartment and lead somewhat of a sane life, even in a still dangerous city. But in fact, during the war, and again, this is why you ask gender questions about unemployment, always, 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 and that is that while women were losing their jobs at a higher rate than men, men's unemployment became the most politically salient. And as with many governments around the world, it's male unemployment that makes public officials nervous, not women's unemployment. Women's unemployment means that women go back to doing what is, quote, natural. All right? That definitely has quotes around it. Right? But that means, and the second thing is that it's presumed that women are not a political threat. Well, that's naive, but they don't make male public officials nervous. Male unemployment makes public officials nervous. So you'll see that both the U.S.-led coalition and the local Iraqi government have not been giving much attention at all to women's employment. There have been training courses, but there are no jobs. So if you take seriously Maha, one of the things I've learned by just thinking about this woman, she's not making headlines, she's not the leader of a major group. What I've learned is a couple of things. One is that war has many more costs than are seen if you just look at a budget. Budgets do not tell us enough about how much any particular war, Afghanistan, Iraq, Congo, it doesn't tell you really what the costs are of war. The second thing is that if you watch Maha, you'll see that the war was not just of a piece. It actually has phases to it. And each of those phases affect women and men differently. And the third thing is that during wartime, women are constantly strategizing, constantly trying to cope with the skills they have, the resources they have or don't have, that in the midst of war, it's not all about political organizing. It's not all about military action. It's also about women trying to make safe themselves and their families. And the fourth thing is that in the midst of the Iraq war, but this is also true in the Congo, it's true in Rwanda, it's true in many countries, in the midst of war, many women do organize. What is striking is that there's been a women's movement in Iraq since the 1950s, well, really since the 1920s. But particularly since the end of the 50s, there's been women's independent groups, sometimes allied with political parties, sometimes autonomous. And one of the most vital groups now organizing in Iraq are widows' groups. Widows' groups have, in war zones, become very politically important. If you look at Guatemala and Rwanda, in fact, you'll find that it's women's groups that have been really crucial to the remaking of the country after wars. In Iraq, widows now are beginning to organize because they're organizing around the rebuilding of their country in ways that make women's voices heard, make women's experiences central to what it means to rebuild a country. So taking just Maha, this is just one quote-unquote ordinary woman, makes us, I think, makes me certainly, much more realistic about what it means to have experienced the Iraq War. Thank you very much. Right. So if you have any questions, that's great, but if you also have any thoughts about this or you've experienced the Iraq or Afghan war somehow in your town or in the schools your grandkids are attending or in your extended family, it's important. This is a good time to share some of those stories.